Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you like this podcast, you will love my new anthology called Moms Don't Have Time to Have Kids. Check it out, and you'll hear from 49 authors about all sorts of things moms don't have time to do. All the authors have been on this podcast. Also, check out my TikTok, @with Zibby and Tracy, my other podcast, Sex Talk with Zibby and Tracy. Check out Moms Don't Have Time to Write on Medium. And of course, my new publishing company called Zibby Books. And now back to our daily author interview site and a quick hello from some of my kids. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Enjoy the show. Albert Samaha is the author of Concepcion, An Immigrant Family's Fortunes. Albert is an investigative journalist and inequality editor at BuzzFeed News, a Whiting Foundation creative nonfiction grant recipient. He is also the author of Never Ran, Never Will, Boyhood and Football in a Changing American Inner City, which was a finalist for the 2019 PEN ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing. He lives in Brooklyn. Welcome, Albert. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss Concepcion, An Immigrant Family's Fortunes.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have to say, I learned so much about, you have so much history in here, so much, not just about your culture's immigration, but really America itself and how, how our country sort of has come to be. And I love how you framed the whole thing up until like the American flag outside your home, perhaps being stolen, but really it wasn't stolen. And like the whole trajectory of almost the downfall of America, to be honest, right? Like the dashed dreams and what's become of America today. So I feel like your family story kind of illustrates this rise and fall, which is a huge goal in a book. So tell me about your impetus for the book, your idea for writing this book, and if the changing tides, so to speak, were part of why you wanted to get this down.
Absolutely so. At first, subconsciously, until it eventually emerged in my mind what the book would be about. I think it was maybe around 2016 was when the idea struck me that I wanted to write a story about my family. By that point, I kind of knew a lot of the mythology of my family. I knew the story of my great-auntie Caridad being an underground spy in World War II. I knew about my granduncle who was a painter and a congressperson. And I knew kind of the general idea that my family had come from prominence in the Philippines. But by 2016, we're talking almost a decade into the recession or after the crash. And I'd seen my elders were struggling financially, my mom, one of them. And I think around that time, I was reaching the age that many of them were when they came to the States. And so I think the convergence of those two things, me sort of being more interested in wondering what it was like for them at that stage in their lives, while also seeing that sort of the final outcome or the long-term outcome of them coming here, sacrificing what they left behind in the Philippines, was them still struggling. It kind of just raised all these questions in my mind. And I think my natural instinct as a writer is like, when there are questions that trouble me, I need to process it by writing about it, if nothing else for myself. And so I think the sort of arc of American history was just sort of implicit in that personal, familial arc of them kind of rising and falling along with the tides of America. So the impetus wasn't necessarily to show the rise and fall of this empire. I think that was something that came along later. I just knew it was going to be a book about my family. The themes, the big picture ideas, none of that was clear to me yet. And that's something that definitely evolved over time. I think if you go back and read like the initial book proposal I had back in like 2017, 2018 or whatever, a lot of the concepts that ended up in a book weren't there yet. And I think that's such a testament to just the process of working on a book project over 5 years, is that your mind's going to evolve, your ideas are going to evolve, and a lot of the questions you start off with will lead to answers you didn't necessarily plan for. And I think that's kind of the fun part of this project for me.
What would be fun is if there was some sort of like a writerly contest where you took the names and titles off of book proposals and to see if you could even figure out which book came out of the proposal. Wouldn't that be fun? That. Yeah. Right? Yeah. This is like, these are the nerdy things I think are fun. But anyway, no, it's true. You never know where your book is going to go. And I think you are joined by many, many people in using writing as a tool to kind of figure out the noise in your head and where, how to process everything. I feel like kind of bad for people who don't do that because I'm like, well, how do they process everything? I don't know.
I know, right? Yeah. It's so true because it really is like that process of not wanting the stuff to be in vain. It's, I think, part of it for me. It's like if I see something bad happening. I remember it was like years ago, me and a buddy of mine kind of went out and had like a night where we like drank too much and like it was just like a mess. And I woke up feeling really, really bad. I had lost my watch and it was just a really, really tough morning, like emotionally and psychologically. And I just wrote a short story about it, a fictionalized short story about it, because I'm like, well, at least my lost watch will not be in vain. At least that troubling night won't be in vain. I'll have like a small piece of art about it.
Totally. I know. I'm like, I'm getting reading glasses, and it's been like a whole thing because I've always had perfect vision. And in the back of my head, I'm just like storing away these little tidbits because I'm like, well, I'm going to write a whole thing about like what it's like to be middle-aged and get reading glasses. Not that anybody really cares, but other middle-aged people getting reading glasses might care. Anyway, yes, but I don't know. Anyway, the book talks a lot about your identity, right? And your identity growing up and being from the Philippines, from your family's history in the Philippines. And, you know, even talking to your cousin being like, him saying at one point, like, we had maids, do you know what I mean? Like, we had it good. Like, what are we doing here? You know, like what? And then you're growing up in America and staking this claim out for yourself. At one point in the book, you said your mother was trying really hard to raise you almost to be white. And yet you, at that time, actually wanted to be Black. So there were, because of all the cultural role models and things that were going in. And then your main identity ended up being found through football, which as a family of football loving people, I'm like very interested in that element too. So tell me a little bit about, and that of course is like the most American thing you can hang your hat on, right? The football. So tell me a little bit about that, especially that time of your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that kind of age growing up for any person about it's many times about finding identity, right? Especially as you get to that like prepubescent adolescent stage. And I think that like those years, like I had a very like in those years, I was very conscious of like the process of figuring out like who am I? What kind of style do I have? Very conscious of the effect that, you know, you almost overcompensate. You're like, you want to prove to the world you're this type of person. And it had always one of those things that I would always sort of look back at and like sort of cringe at like my lack of understanding of like, what does it mean to be like a Filipino American, a person who is neither white nor Black in America? Where do I fit in? So those questions were already sort of percolating at the time. And I think one of the things I enjoyed about this process is that kind of these memories that in my mind I cringed at make for really good material afterwards. You know, and it's part of that thing too of like, well, at least it's not in vain. But also, it's I mean, I think throughout the book, I think it's always, you know, if there's someone to be poked fun at, I hope it's like me as a narrator, right? Is that like one purpose I hope to serve as a narrator is to serve as like a proxy for ideas I hope to undermine, because better to undermine myself than to undermine others, I think, because I have an insight into why I felt this way and can explore it. So it ended up being the section of the book I think I enjoyed writing the most, kind of going back to those particular years where I did have a lot of memories that I thought about often, but had never really like reflected on in mind. And so much of this book process was either going back in deep history, which were based on interviews, or kind of going back to recent history, which was already kind of baked into my mind as stuff I knew I was going to write. But kind of there was a sweet spot of years of childhood that I was very familiar with, but had never really reflected on, and that was part of it. And I think it sort of goes to your first question of how this is a book that it's more about the history of America than about the history of the Philippines. And I think that's very much a product of a lot of the ideas that developed in terms of kind of the identity lane, because I think when I initially came into the book, the sort of elevator pitch or whatever was the idea that this is an immigration. This is a book about immigrants. And what I realized midway through writing it is that it's not a book about immigrants. It's a book about the children of immigrants. They're really the core voice, the core perspective, frame of reference is from the children of immigrants. And that's, to me, what I hope would make the book more unique, is that as common as immigrant narratives are in America, land of immigrants, not often. Those are far more often the stories of those who sort of are left to kind of carry on that legacy. And that's when I sort of realized, like, oh, this book actually is as much about me, if not more about me, than it is about the other characters. Even though those characters may have more sort of face time or more scene time than me as a character in many chapters, that the sort of frame of reference is what is it like to look back on that and to question that and to develop kind of what does it mean to be American. And like me as an American, it had to be an American book because that's sort of what I know best. I can't tell a story about like the history of the Philippines and what it means to be Filipino because that's not my experience. That's not the frame of reference that I have. And so to me, it was this book in a lot of ways, kind of the core intellectual arc of the book is this journey of me figuring out what it means to be American.
And I loved how you sort of tied it up at the end with your half sisters coming from Beirut, and you're being like, well, and them thinking like, the TikTok influencers are the coolest things ever, and like what they're wearing, and how there is still something so magnetic, or there is a leadership element still to America that hopefully will, I don't know, come back or something, but even in popular culture, if nothing else, which is great. You said something funny about the football and about like even learning how to manage your own emotions. And I also really enjoyed this part because, I was trying to get to know you as the writer and everything, but you said before games, I delivered speeches about shocking the world. At halftime, I'd slam my helmet into lockers and expletive-filled tantrums denigrating our efforts. After each loss, I sobbed in the locker room, face buried in my gloved hands with a teammate or two to share in the anguish. Our poor girlfriends would be waiting in the parking lot an hour after the game's conclusion, asking anyone exiting the locker room, are they still in there crying?
That's another example of like those cringeworthy moments that make for great material looking back. If I didn't have a book to put that on, to put that in, it would just kind of linger in my head. It's like, and I wanted the book to be filled with the sort of stories that I just like tell my friends. Like I wanted the book to sound like you were just sitting next to me at like a cafe and asking me what high school was like. And like, that's one of the stories that I always tell. And I do think one of the challenges of for me, of like memoir writing is that when I sort of came into it, I had this list of like, here are these vivid scenic memories that surely are going to be part of the book. And then I start to realize that a lot of these memories that I held very vividly in my mind did not necessarily have significant narrative impact on like the course of events in the book or on my life, right? And that sometimes the inflection point at a certain stage was not this kind of vivid memory of this happening at lunchtime, but actually some other less vivid memory, some vague, more abstract memory was, the day things actually changed type thing. So, and I think, so part of this process was kind of figuring out which, as a journalist, the challenge is usually getting enough information to tell the story, where here is this overflow of information and it's figuring out, it's like a block of marble that you have to chisel out the figure out of. And that would, to me, was, I think, what the most challenging part is like these like scenes or anecdotes I thought were hilarious, or I thought were just like interesting, vivid scenes I was excited to write, but had absolutely no impact on like the course of my life or the course of anyone else. So it's like, oh, that shouldn't be part of the book then. And I think separating memories that were vivid from memories that were actually meaningful to the story was a really interesting process that required like really a lot of reflection. And I needed all those years to kind of have to process all that.
Yeah. I feel like that's one of those things that you need to see as you're writing, right? Like, where is it even going? Like, to your point at the beginning, right? Like, maybe these scenes do have a purpose, but if you end up trying to prove a different point with the book, I mean, I feel like one of your underlying points was that you have this sense of guilt about your mom, honestly, and where she has ended up in life. And here you are, she's come over, she gave up all this privilege that she had in the Philippines to give you this life, and you describe your life, and you have become this huge success and all the rest, and have lived out sort of the dream, right? The fantasy, you followed all the steps and everything. And yet now it's the end of her life, or towards the end of her life. I shouldn't say that, but as we all are getting older, and there's no clear path to really financial security in the country. And her attempts, I mean, I was heartbroken when you talked about how she finally got this job in March of February of 2020. And then of course was like furloughed in March. And I was like, oh my gosh, she just cannot get a break, right? It's just felt like almost helpless. And I could feel you kind of trying to sort out how to deal with that, right? Like, how do you as the son deal with that? How do you help? How do you, and you're obviously doing things like coming to her rescue and making sure she's not scammed by these internet creeps and things like that. And that was a hilarious scene, by the way, with the two of you laughing and everything. But it's almost like I could feel you being like, what am I supposed to do here? I mean, what am I supposed to do? Is that sort of how you're feeling about it now? And like, what have you come to any conclusions?
Basically, no, not really. And
Yeah.
like it's that, like, so many aspects of that are just unresolved, right? And
Mm.
I think one thing that sort of framed my thinking on both how to write those and how to think about and process those aspects was just like in my work as a reporter, I like knowing how commonplace sort of the arc of my mom's story in America is. And like speaking to people almost literally every day who describe similar, oftentimes like much worse situations financially, but kind of rooted in this idea of, I mean, so much of it stems from the crash in '08. And I mean, it's bigger than that, right? There are so many other forces. There's larger economic trajectories in the country, but much like COVID, like the crash in '08 accelerated those things and like exposed those things, and kind of there in a moment when for people without much margin for error that like dissolved the margins and stuff. So like this arc of kind of the crash hits and like things are bad. And I think everyone kind of acknowledges that, where it's like, okay, this horrible catastrophe has happened. We're all knocked off our feet. And then in the years since, it's like been this like rebuilding process, right? That everyone sort of from that point, from that kind of ground zero point of the crash, everyone's been trying to rebuild and figure things out. And then now, more than a decade later, a lot of folks are still sort of in that process and have never fully made themselves whole again. And eventually, at some point within those 12 years, 13 years, you realize that what seemed to be kind of a temporary setback is actually a new normal. And what seemed to be a temporary struggle is indefinite. And that there is no necessary like making it all back, right? That it's not as simple as it was then. That a lot of the elements, and one of the things I try to get at in the book is that a lot of this question of like a lot of the like all that money we made in the 2000s, you know, was that a reflection of, was that the normal state of things? And then this was just sort of like a blip that we have to revert back to the normal state of things? Or was that the blip? Were those years of like the housing bubble and inflated market and kind of money out of thin air and all that money coming in, us being able to afford the Benz, was that actually the exceptional moment? And everything else is just the normal thing. And like, but it's impossible to see that at the time. So I think for me, processing it has been this part, I guess, I mean, the book's part of processing it. And I think one of the lines early in the book that kind of gets at that is realizing that, yeah, it's no longer, I think the line was like, no longer, their struggles were no longer a toll to pay on the road to easier days, but a permanent struggle. So that idea of the mindset shifting from, this is just a temporary thing that we're going to get over soon, to like, oh no, this is just how things are. And the importance of that recognition, because you make different decisions when you recognize that a moment is like indefinite as opposed to temporary. You make more urgent decisions. And so that sort of raised my urgency of like, oh, this is actually, we need to adjust like our financial partnership in a way that is not just about building up debt, knowing that a windfall will come, that we have to like create like a stable system. And I think that the difficulty of finding that stability first starts with having to recognize that it is indefinite and there's no sort of help around the corner.
Interesting. So the real question is, do people comment on your dimples all the time? Because I also have dimples and people are always commenting on it. And I feel like there should be more attention, like, to people who have dimples. Like, maybe there's some personality traits, or maybe there's some commonality, or I don't know. Anyway, thoughts on dimples?
They do all the time. It's the first thing. I'm staying with you. And I do think there's similar personality traits that are not necessarily tied to genetics, but tied to sort of growing up with the affirmation of people always telling you how nice your dimples are. So like we might just be more like positive, fun-loving people because we like feel special and we feel kind of empowered. Like I have no doubt that my life is at least 15 to 25% easier just from the subconscious biases that people like give me from having the dimples.
Wow, that is
like,
so
I'll take what I can get.
Oh my gosh, I'd never
I'll take what I can get. We all need our edge.
Yeah, we all need our edge. Okay. Hashtag dimples. Love it. And are you a football fan? Do you like to watch football still?
I am. I do. You know, love football. I watch it with a lot more of sort of the clear-eyed guilt, I think, than I did before, as maybe a lot of us do. But I think there was a point where I realized that it's just a part of my life. It's just like, I will just like, I'll still, even when I read like that Uber pays its drivers poorly, it's like, oh, I want to report on it and I feel bad about this, but I still kind of gotta take this Uber, or like, or those, when I like ordering Amazon stuff where it's like, I feel the same way about football, where it's like, life is too short to fight every battle. And I hope to advocate that like players get healthcare funds and, people have more awareness about the fact that like, the people that make millions of dollars in the NFL, we're talking millions of dollars stretched over like 3 years as their entire earnings potential, and that football is like a disposable labor force in ways much more extreme than any other sport, where like the average literal lifespan and career lifespan is shorter, and there's more players, right? It's like it's a machine, it's a warehouse. So I acknowledge all that to myself to help alleviate or to mitigate the guilt, at least, so that like by the time the divisional weekend starts, I've already processed like, yeah, this is fucked up. But anyway, let me pop on my television and enjoy 2 days straight of football. So yeah, I still watch. It's just always going to be a part of me. Like I'm sure there are going to be very real historical comparisons with like Roman gladiators, obviously many differences in many ways. They weren't paid. They were often slaves and stuff like that. But in the way that when we think back to the Roman times, like that gladiators was just a part of it, and a part of it that we all sort of now agree was like, oh, what a horrible thing that they had. But also we don't think of sort of savages for that. We don't think of them as brutes for like participating in that entertainment. We're just like, well, that was just like what they do. That's what they did back then. I think it'll be sort of similar now, where it's like, we know it's kind of messed up, and we hope that things get better in terms of how players are treated, and that, I still don't believe that the rule changes will make a significant difference in like health and safety, because I think it's the subconcussive hits that are long term. But I think to me, the most important thing is acknowledging that. Is let's not just sit here and pretend a couple of rule changes are going to drastically change the long-term health implications. Let's admit to ourselves, this is a brutal sport that will really mess people up. And yes, as long as they have the informed consent and they're making an active choice that they know what they're getting into, and as long as like the NFL is providing them with proper like healthcare and medical treatment, I can at least feel okay knowing that. But I still don't know if that's fully the case. So I don't know if I could feel okay about that. But so to answer your question, yes, I still watch football. And I'm a Niner fan, so I'm feeling good these days.
Oh, I was wondering who you were rooting for. Yeah. I shouldn't even say this. I was going to say my son often changes like midway through the game. Whoever's like winning, he's like, "Well, now I'm a this fan. Now I'm
I was like that as a kid. I think that's great. I think that's a great way to like develop a positive emotional relationship with sports, as
that's
opposed
a nice
to
way to say that.
Because I feel like I early on became like a Bay Area sports fan, and there were some really like difficult years where like when the Warriors were really bad and the Giants had some tough playoff losses. And I would sometimes just hop on like, you know what? I don't feel like being a Warrior fan right now. Let me watch the King, Chris Webber, because I was able to develop some positive memories. So especially if your family has teams that are struggling, it's a useful thing to hold them over in the meantime.
Well, I'm sure you're working on another book, and I'm curious what you are doing after this book, but maybe there's like a football themed book in your future too. I would be interested in like the impact of the red zone on the trajectory of how people watch and consume football, and attention span and fandom, and I don't know. There's probably a book like this, but I feel like you could write that.
I think so. I'll always be connected to football. I'll always be interested in football. Part of me also feels like I'm like worried about being too connected to football. My first book was about football. I followed this youth football team in Brownsville, Brooklyn. But it was sort of very focused on like that community. Wasn't about like NFL stuff, kind of the bigger picture stuff you're talking about. And then the second book, I had that whole chapter about football. So, and I played college football, and like that's usually mentioned in like reviews and stuff. So a small part of me is like, oh man, if I write too much about football, well, I'm not over it. I'm not over it, but part of me is like, I don't want to be like shoehorned as like, oh, that's the football guy, I don't know. So maybe
I didn't even think that was a risk. Okay, sorry. I didn't even think that was like on the horizon as a risk, but yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Never ran, never will. Boyhood and football in a changing American inner city. I know, but that's not exactly what I meant. But okay, whatever.
Right.
Anyway, all right. Anyway.
I still enjoy it. And it's probably like an unfair like it's probably a reflection of my insecurities of like, coming up as like no one had a football background, always being worried, like people only think I cared about sports. And so I've always been like, because I came up as a sports writer. So I've always been like insecure about, but I don't know. I'm interested in like the NFL and like the business of it. And I would love to do one of those like follow a team for yearbooks, like collision crossers or some of the, like if you can get access. So like it's on somewhere on the horizon. I don't know if it'll be the next one because of those insecurities, but I think at some point, once I have like enough books under my belt, so it's like, well, he only has like 2 books about football.
Fine. I get it. Well, I honestly, I mean, I think anybody, looking at this on the shelf would not be like, oh, just another sports writer writing another sports book. Okay? It's like this like very literary immigrant, reported. Anyway, whatever. Okay. What is next for you, and what advice would you have for aspiring authors?
I don't know what's next. I think about it a lot. I have like vague ideas of I think the next project that I'm like working on, like jotting ideas down and starting to like gather some early string. I wanted to give myself more time to sort of process and transition this time around than the first time around, where I started this book like a year before the first book came out, and that was like that was fine, but it was like I feel like I've been working 2 jobs for like 8 years. So one of my goals has been to like slow down a little bit and like take a step back, read broadly, explore some curiosities, develop my inner child once more, and like just like, read about interests that I haven't thought about in a while, and come from a fresh place, right? Like I want the next book to be like from a different writer, basically, like with a different set of knowledge and interests. And so yeah, I don't know yet. I definitely know I want it to be, I want it to be different than the first 2 books, whatever that means. Like I want it to feel different, like a different texture. And in terms of advice, I think anyone like working on a book, I really do believe that like the more time you can put into it, the better it will be. And I mean that in a very linear sense, like we're into infinity, where if you spend 100 years on a book, it would be like better than if you'd spend 50 years and so on. And it's kind of just that, like, it's all just like that point of diminishing returns. And like, you can't obviously practically spend 20 years on a book because, well, 1, you got to get paid for it. And 2, you're probably going to be sick of it by then. But like, I don't think I could imagine spending less than like 5 years on a book or 4 years, because as we talked about earlier, like so many of the ideas just kind of need time to manifest and process. And just like those nights, you're just sort of like lying in bed thinking about the project, or when, like, for me, a lot of the ideas sort of just kind of chisel away at them, right? It's not like there's these major breakthroughs that just come while you're writing. It's like it comes when I'm standing in the shower, just kind of thinking about some chapter and like how to connect some threads together. And they don't happen every time I think about it in the shower, but it's like chipping away at a wall, knowing that eventually you don't know when you'll get to the end of the wall, but you'll eventually break through. And so I think you sort of have to earn the breakthroughs. And I think it's about knowing that they're not always going to come. Like I always tell, reporters how like so much of reporting is failure. It's like you call 100 people, 95 of them are going to not talk to you or not respond or hang up in your face. And you just have to know you have to make the 100 calls or the 5 calls. If you need 5 calls, you have to make 100 calls. You have to know that coming in. And I think it's like that, like writing a book, where it's like, if you want the ideas to develop, you have to give them time. You have to like do things that inspire the ideas, go to museums and like it's not just like the writing of, sitting down, typing and like doing interviews and researching. Like it really does require like a lot of thought. And the people I often feel bad for are like the seemingly fortunate people that like you write a big magazine article, publisher hits you up like, oh, this is great, let's turn this into a book. You have 18 months, and naturally that process will just be a process of just sort of expanding, the story you already have, because you only have 18 months to develop it. But I think to like sort of create a whole new story, a brand new story, I think requires more time. So I think my top advice is like, give yourself as much time as you can. And whether that's like working the job you need to work to pay the bills so that you can like spend nights working on the book, or like, or chipping away, double dipping if you're a journalist with like some of the other projects you're working on for your day job. Like I didn't go on book leave for my first book. And then for the second book, I probably don't know, like 6 weeks of book leave. And so for me, it was like, yeah, I couldn't have done that in a year. I kind of had to stretch it out. I mean, I think it worked out fine, like in terms of developing the idea. So that's what I'd say is like, the more time you can buy yourself, the easier, the more fulfilling I think it'll be.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you, Albert, for coming on. And I will be thinking of you and your mom, and I'm hoping she's okay. And, all of your story, it really, I don't know, it just really sunk in and was very powerful. So I'm really glad I got to read about your life. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Pleasure. Great chatting.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
You too.
Okay.
Peace.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.